Hello, fiendlings. How the hell are you? Well, the water situation remains unresolved. It turns out a tree root has shattered pipes, and this particular tree is massive and close to the house. Therefore, the plumbers won't touch it. Instead, they're going to run a new line to the house, which requires almost 75 feet of trenching, knocking out drywall, and possibly replacing a few other pipes inside the house. It ain't going to be cheap. So if you've got a buck or two you can throw my way for all the content I've posted over the last several years, you can buy me a coffee or become a patron. Or buy my books. That always helps too. Links are in the show notes. I'm closing in on the end of the new novel and expect to have the first draft ready sometime next week. I still have more than a month to whip it into shape and get it out there. The most difficult part of this book might be finding a title for it. It's rare that happens, but here we are. We'll see. Maybe I'll hold a contest. Time to get back to the writing. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 3 of Neptune Scars. Chapter 4. Dickerson stood at the dais in Training Dome 3. The dome, 50 meters high and a kilometer in diameter, contained 2 salvage wrecks from the Battle of the Scar, as well as a few other obstacles he'd managed to secure. He hadn't gotten to the point of printing new ones, but he was close to it. His dais floated 10 meters above the deck, his suit's visor lit up as though the darkened dome were bathed in daylight. On his display were 2 squads of Marines, one attacking, one defending. The SV Knoll wreck, coupled with a few bulkheads from the original Trident station, made for good cover, as well as the occasional game of hide-and-seek. He'd been at this for more than an hour, changing positions, adding or taking away obstacles and hindrances, such as interrupting comms, unexpected explosions, and the like, just to visualize the problems. Gunnery Sergeant Dickerson. The title still made no sense to him and made him feel as though he were dreaming when he was addressed by it. Dreaming? More like delusional. He'd awakened after the Battle of the Scar to discover most of his comrades were dead, including his former lover, as well as the man who'd saved his career. Now he was expected to replace Gunny Cartwright and train the next generation, the first generation, he reminded himself, of Trident Station's security forces. Marines, he thought. Just call them void damn Marines. Not like the SFMC can sue you. He smiled at that. Security forces did sound a little anemic. Trident Station needed multi-environment combat troops to fight off enemies both human and exosolar, secure the station against threats both internal and external, and provide safe trade corridors to the inner planets. Sure, and next Trident Station will ask for a pony. So will Commander Dunn. Well, that wasn't fair exactly. Dunn, his former captain in Black Company, knew quite well what Dickerson had to put together. The 2 men understood what they expected from one another as well. Until Dickerson had recruits, it didn't matter how many plans he came up with or training missions he designed. First and foremost, he needed people. Counting the 2 survivors from SNR Blue as well as the 8 remaining Marines from SNR Black, all he had to draw on were the SFN forces that had been stationed at Trident. Most of those were nowhere near combat ready or had been ruled out of bounds due to their quote-unquote logistical expertise. Dunn's way of saying, hands off. On top of that, Dunn had ruled out the idea of instituting a draft of former SFN personnel. Despite the fact they faced the same Article 15 charges as the commander himself, forcing the Squiddies into active combat duty was a punishment they didn't deserve. Instead, Dunn had made joining Trident's military branch voluntary. The ugly truth, however, is that it takes anywhere from 10 to 12 people to support a single Marine. Between equipment maintenance and repair, printing weapons, ammunition, loading and unloading, life support, food, and a billion other odds and ends, it took a lot of effort and resources to fight a war, especially when the enemy could only be fought in space and swam through the dark matter as though it were an ocean. Dickerson would much rather have his job, as distasteful as it might be, of preparing fresh meat for the grinder. All it took was willpower, imagination, leadership, and a few relatively inexpensive weapons. He couldn't imagine the kind of stress of having to negotiate with Belters, attempt a non-aggression pact with other outer planet settlements, and somehow get a real trade route going. Dickerson would rather fight Exos. A message appeared on his HUD and he blinked at it before a lazy grin spread across his face. He accepted the link request and said, "And how are you, Portunas?" Portunas, one of the members of the trio that served as the brains and, one might argue, the very souls of Trident Station, was the most communicative of the 3. As such, Dickerson looked forward to conversations with the sentient entity just as he enjoyed conversing with Black. Unlike Black, who'd been created for a single purpose, or so it would seem, this incarnation of Portunas and its brethren had been designed to grow with humanity, their underlying mission being the survival of the station itself. At least, that was the theory. The only certainty was that these entities, this trio, had been designed by the collective. Apart from that, all bets were off. Still, paranoia wasn't Dickerson's strong suit. If he started entertaining the idea that the trio were plotting against the denizens of Trident Station, he'd never sleep again. That kind of stress just wasn't worth it. Delusional though it might be, he chose to believe they were what they appeared to be, sentient entities growing up and into their own.
I'm fine, Sergeant, for various quantities of fine.
Dickerson smirked at that. You trying to learn a sense of humor again?
Sense of humor is more active. I think I'm going for more of a sense of whimsy.
Whimsy, huh? Dickerson stared upward at the dome's transparent roof and saw a nest of distant stars sprinkling against the sky. Whimsy's good.
I thought so. I have taken a look at your training regimen.
Dickerson raised a finger as though he were facing Portunez. Considering how many cameras there were around the station, it was a good bet that he was. Potential training regimen.
Yes, potential.
You have a comment or two? Dickerson asked knowingly.
Of course. Thus far, your plans have only included squads of up to 2 fire teams each. When will you widen the theater?
Widen the theater? Dickerson looked over the large dome and realized just how empty it really was. It was larger than necessary for 25 Marines, let alone the 12 he'd planned for. And Trident had 4 of these domes. 4.
No offense, Sergeant, but you seem as though you're prepping for a company, not a regiment.
Holy shit. Is that what he was expected to build? He and Kelly? That's a good point, Dickerson said. No offense taken. He swiped left and the holodisplay winked out of existence. Guess you're right. Thinking small.
Thinking small is not a bad thing. In my simulations, as well as my analyses of human history, seemingly simple details have often led to victory or defeat.
Think small, act big? He asked. Not sure that phrase is going to catch on. Fortunas was silent for a moment, leaving Dickerson wondering if he'd offended the entity. When it finally spoke, however, it seemed more amused.
Not quite, but I think you have the idea.
Dickerson laughed. Took you a while to parse that slang, huh?
That is one way of describing it.
Dickerson sighed. You given any thought to my idea of aerial training?
Yes, I believe with the right safeguards, it will be more than possible. Constrained, but possible.
Constrained. A kilometer-diameter circus ring that stood 50 meters tall was a lot of room to play with for a couple of SV null and a few combat skiffs. If the dome were cleared of obstacles, the craft would have even more room. I'm a ground pounder, Dickerson said. Talby's the man with the aerial experience. I don't think in 3 dimensions quite the way he or Oakes do.
Then I would suggest approaching them for ideas as well.
Of course, Dickerson said. Just hadn't thought big. Portunus had nothing to say to that. Dickerson stretched his spine and groaned in pleasure. As long as I'm thinking big, what about using one of the new ships for combat exercises?
That is a question for the commander and the collective.
Yeah, I guess it is, Dickerson said. Training won't matter if I don't have Marines to train.
True. My understanding is that there are efforts underway to that end.
There are, Dickerson said. Just haven't had an update in a while. I'm getting antsy.
Is the preparation for training not stimulating enough?
Not really, no. I just end up doing the same sims over and over again.
Not anymore. Now you're thinking bigger.
Dickerson chuckled. I can design training for my ideal platoon. The kinds of non-coms, the kinds of grunts, and the skill sets. I could have a great mix of rookies, hardened vets, and mid-career Marines, and I still wouldn't know how well they would work together until I threw them in the grinder.
Too many variables?
Fortunas offered. Exactly. You might be able to run a couple of billion sims a second, but I can't, nor can the Marines that are going to fight.
If the block network were active again, that problem would be moot.
Dickerson flinched. Why did you say that? He could practically hear the entity shrugging.
With enough time and experience, the trio could properly plot the actions and outcomes of any battle within 90 to 99% accuracy.
Can you now? Dickerson said. How would you do that? The variables in a battle are constantly in flux.
Forgive me, but I disagree. In every picosecond, the variables for battle are set. The number of adversaries is fixed. The available number of weapons, rounds, missiles, support craft, and marines are all known. They do not change.
Ah, Dickerson said. I see what you mean. Okay, so what happens if, let's say, one of the ships has a massive weapon that doesn't fire? How do your sims account for that?
Are you asking if certain variables are more heavily weighted than others?
I guess, Dickerson said. But if in your sim the massive weapon fires and in real life it doesn't, how accurate will one of your conclusions be?
One of my sims will account for the weapon not firing. All the variables will still be known.
I wonder about that, Dickerson said. Could you have predicted what the collective were up to with Mira without all the data points? No.
Even in hindsight, there are enough gaps in the records and history to make it impossible to know how they managed it all, although we do have theories.
Of course you do. My point is that you say all the variables are accounted for. Not true. What about the exosolar threat that just materialized from a previously unknown tear? Fortunas was silent for a moment.
They would be an unaccounted for variable.
Exactly. Simulations can't account for the unknown. You can't map reality.
Interesting turn of phrase, although I disagree.
Dickerson cocked an eyebrow. I can't wait to hear this. Why do you disagree?
Infinite universe, infinite possibilities. Therefore, impossibility itself is an impossibility.
Dickerson said. I'll keep that in mind.
That said, I find it highly improbable that anyone in our dimension has managed it.
The word dimension sent a shiver down his spine, although he didn't know exactly why. It conjured images of the exosolar creatures and the unseen horrors that awaited humanity on just the other side of the scar. Were they in a different dimension? Or was there something he was missing? Not enough data, he mused.
No,
The entity agreed.
mere conjecture.
At some point, though, Dickerson said, we got to get lucky and be right for once. He paused for a moment before adding, although sometimes it's better to be wrong.
I assume you mean thinking the worst and having it be as bad as you thought it would be?
Yeah, something like that. Fortunas paused.
I assume that's better than proceeding on the best case scenario, only to discover the worst.
Too true, Dickerson said. Makes me sound like a pessimist, but I always err on the side of bad. At least then I can be pleasantly surprised.
You do realize the fallacy in that statement. You are purposely deluding yourself in order to avoid disappointment.
You know, Dickerson said, you take the poetry out of everything.
I hope not. But I'll assume you're being sarcastic rather than literal. I'd rather not know if it's the latter.
Now you're getting it. Chapter 5. When Dunn finally arrived in his ready room, he found Talby, his XO, sitting in front of a carafe, magmug in hand. By the looks of his eyes, Dunn guessed the man had already consumed more than his share of the ship's caffeine stores. Either that, or he was hopped up on stims. Dunn didn't like the latter possibility. Talby rose after putting his cup on the table. Before he had a chance, Dunn said, "At ease," and shut the hatch behind him. The ready room, designed to fit a dozen comfortably, felt too large and too empty. Dunn had heard his voice echo in here more than once. He missed his ready room aboard SNR Black. That had been spacious enough without feeling like an empty dance hall. Maybe the trio had made that design decision based on other factors. Regardless, he could have used a room half its size, maybe a quarter. He sat heavily in his chair and slumped forward slightly. They on? Talby reached behind him to the serving table, pulled a full mag mug and placed it in front of Dunn. I think you'll need this. Dunn raised himself and sniffed the cup. Just the smell was enough to pop his eyes open. Good fuel for the nannies, he said, and took a long sip of the near scalding hot liquid. Thank you. Welcome, sir. The collective has activated the QE comms, so Soul Fed is waiting on us. Dunn smiled. Be the first time they waited on us. True, Talby said. We should just skip the meeting. Tell them we have more important things to do, like take a shit. Dunn shook his head. No, can't do that. The collective set this meet. We're going to be good little humans and act like we care. Tubby laughed. Aye, sir. After a long sip, Dunn swallowed hard, gathered himself, and said, "Let's join the party. Portunus, connect us."
"Of course, Commander,"
Portunus said over the speakers. A hollow display came to life, the Trident Station logo briefly appearing before fading out. The Solfed logo appeared on the left side, while an empty window came to life on the right. Dunn exchanged an uneasy glance with Talby as the right window started to count down from 10. At 1, the Solfed logo dissolved into a picture of 3 people seated around a table. Each had a partitioned hollow display in front of them, making their torsos appear as though they'd been cut from their bodies. Dunn immediately recognized all 3 of them and held back a snarl. These were the 3 that had declared Article 15. These were the 3 spreading lies about Trident and what had happened. These 3 were now in control, or what passed for it. "Greetings," Dunn said. Admiral Nestor stared with squinting eyes, a grim expression on his face. The man had aged since the last time Dunn had laid eyes on him several years ago. Maybe recent events had taken their toll, or maybe he was just coming to the end of the line. Dunn hoped for the latter. Chancellor Munez, her long raven and white striped hair tied up in a tight bun, looked as though she were rested and ready to eat someone for breakfast. Dunn was fairly sure he was on the menu. The third, the one that both surprised him and infuriated him the most, was Solfed Chief Scientist Abarak. The woman had become a quasi-religious lunatic since the collective pulled the rug out from under humanity. This was going to be a void of an interesting conversation.
"Hello,"
Chancellor Munez said, her voice husky and breathy.
"I'm sure you know the Admiral and Chief Scientist."
"I do," Dunn said. "My XO, James—"
"We know who you are,"
the Admiral said coldly. Dunn smiled. "I'm sure you think you do. The collective called this meeting on your behalf. I assume there's a reason." The Chancellor looked confused, as though Dunn wasn't supposed to talk to her like this, that this was not how the meeting was supposed to go.
There is,"
she said, a little less surely.
"We have a proposition for you."
"This should be good," Talby muttered. Dunn ignored him. "We're listening." The Chancellor gestured to the Admiral.
"We have a number of Sol Federation citizens that wish to travel to Trident Station."
"Travel?" Dunn asked.
"Immigrate,"
the Chancellor said.
"Most wish for asylum of some sort, although why they believe you are a safe harbor, I've no idea."
Dunn tried to keep a flat expression, but he knew the ghost of a grin had broken out across his face. He couldn't help it. "What's wrong with them?" Talby asked. The Admiral cast his eyes in Talby's direction, his face flushed with indignation.
"You will address me as Admiral when you speak to me, former Lieutenant Talby."
"No," Dunn said, stopping Talby from sniping back. "He won't. Neither will I. Answer the question." The Chancellor looked more flustered than ever. Dunn hated the fact he was enjoying this, but couldn't help himself. Ever since the Collective's revolution, these 3 had spouted conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory, none of it making any damn sense to anyone that knew anything about the situation, much less the official story the Collective had seeded. The irony? The Collective had put out the truth. They hadn't pulled any punches, exposing all the corruption in Solfed, exposing the lies around the Mirror Project, as well as the fight and victory of humanity over an alien menace at Neptune. The Collective hadn't lied. Abarak said,
"They're believers, the worst kind."
"What kind of believers?" Talby asked. "Your believers are pretty much the worst I know of." Abarak didn't take the bait.
"Some of them believe in the alien threat nonsense and want to help save humanity. Others believe society has already collapsed and wish to find a refuge."
"Uh-huh," Talby said. "And how many of them have criminal records?" Abarak blinked, and Talby grinned like a shark, but said nothing. "How many wish to emigrate?" Dunn asked.
137 thus far,"
the Chancellor said.
"However, I believe that number will grow once we make the public aware that there's an agreement in place."
The right window filled with text. Dunn cut the comms for a moment and said, "Portunas, give me a summary, please." The wall of text disappeared, replaced by a simple set of bullet points. Dunn furrowed his brow. "So you want technology from us in exchange for us welcoming your criminal and undesirable population?" The three soul-fed representatives looked offended, yet Dunn didn't buy that either. They looked like politicians always looked when they were caught. Deny everything and look hurt. Dunn fucking hated politicians.
Criminals is not necessarily accurate,
the Chancellor said.
There are some with detention records, but nothing overtly violent.
And where is the passenger manifest and records? Talby asked. Or are we just supposed to take whomever shows up? It was a good question, although it was one Dunn had planned to ask later.
The collective has it,
she said. As if on cue, the right-hand window filled with a new document. Fortunas was obviously forwarding whatever he received from the collective. Without being asked, a summation appeared.
The collective,
the Chancellor continued,
has already vetted the list. They removed 43 of the original candidates for unexplained reasons.
Unexplained my ass, Dunn thought. He imagined the collective didn't want soul-fed spies aboard Trident any more than he did. He didn't know exactly what the collective needed the station for, or even why they seemed so intent on saving humanity, but he had to trust their judgment when it came to station security. If the collective were okay with the candidates, then he couldn't complain too much. Still, he'd take a peek at every single file and put together a strike list for any he didn't like. Table that for a moment, Dunn said. What kind of technology do you expect? The chief scientist grinned.
Gravity and QE tech.
Dunn smiled. Gravitic drives and weapons? Sure, we can provide them. The three people on the display all looked confused.
You what?
The Chancellor said.
You will?
Sure, Dunn said. Come here in a ship and I'll load you up with what we understand how to use. But the three of you must be aboard, and you must come alone, no escort, no SFMC, SFN resources, and no funny business.
You're insane,
the Admiral said. And so are you if you think I'm giving you GravTech, Dunn snapped. The three pompous asses went silent, the Admiral grinding his teeth. We are not giving you weapons you can use against us, Dunn said quietly, his voice calm, words even and unmistakably immutable. We are not giving you quantum tech you can use against us. That's not happening, ever. And if we find you in possession of either, there will be consequences of the kind you can't even imagine. I want you to keep in mind, he continued, that the collective put that technology in our hands and not yours for a reason. You can have that discussion with them, but I'm fairly certain they will be the ones nuking you, not us. Still, the answer is unequivocally no. Ask for something else. The Admiral said something under his breath, but Dunn couldn't make it out. Didn't really matter either. Dunn had already won, and they knew it. Now it was just a question of them offering a wish list they thought he might entertain, rather than the insane one they knew he wouldn't. Ah, the art of diplomacy. Dunn fucking hated diplomacy. The Chancellor cleared her throat.
We appreciate your candor, Commander.
Dunn grinned. It was the first time the entire conversation someone had used his title. It wasn't one to stand on them, nor even like them, but it was a bit of an icebreak. In a way, it was an admission, although private and tacit, that he was in charge of Trident Station, whether they liked it or not. Thank you, Chancellor. Dunn nodded.
Our ore refineries and mining industries have taken a severe hit,
she said,
due to, removal of certain automation.
That was a clever way of saying, now that the SEs had rebelled, they had no one to control the machines and an untrained workforce that didn't know how. The words had also been chosen to keep from offending the collective, although Dunn wasn't sure they'd give a shit. Okay, Dunn said. I imagine many other industries, including shipbuilding, have taken a bit of a setback. The Admiral muttered something again, and the Chancellor shot him a glare that could have melted Atmos steel.
Yes, they have. It will take time for Soulfed to remedy the problem. In the interim, we'd like a shipment of Atmos steel as well as iridium, tungsten, and titanium. We have prepared a list of materials in preferred quantities.
Preferred, Dunn echoed. We'll take a look. What else? The chief scientist was smiling again, as though she'd recovered her confidence or maybe her religious fervor.
We want to send a Soulfed physicist to study with Dr. Reed.
You what? Talby asked.
You have her file. Abarak said. I'm sure Dr. Reed knows of her as well.
What do you hope to gain by posting a scientist here? Talby asked. You know all of their comms will be monitored. It will be impossible for them to get you meaningful covert information. Plus, we could wipe their comms if they have information we don't wish you to have. The XO looked as though he were a little too pleased with himself. So what's the point? The chief scientist seemed nonplussed.
If I understand correctly, the collective wants us to leave Earth. They've said that if humanity doesn't, it will be destroyed. Is that correct?
Dunn had a bad feeling of what was coming next. That is correct.
Evacuating that many humans from Earth and from Mars will require a significant leap forward in our current technologies. Otherwise, it is absolutely inconceivable we could move that many people within a century.
True, Dunn said.
Therefore, as I see it, there are 3 options. You give us gravitic drives for our ships. We study gravitic drives so we may build our own, or you print a fleet of ships to evacuate us.
She grinned a polished, toothy smile.
Unless there's something I'm overlooking?
Dunn said nothing. If we were to have someone from Solfed on staff, Talby said, they would have to live here as a military asset, meaning they'd take their orders from Trident Command as though it was a direct order from the Admiral here, or from you, Chancellor, or you, Doctor. The Chancellor nodded.
Of course, you are, after all, a military station.
Something you should keep in mind, Dunn wanted to say, but didn't. There was little point in getting into a pissing match with these bureaucrats. Besides, whatever they said in private was most certainly not what they would say about this press conference. Their version of the meeting would be quite different than what actually happened. Dunn wished the collective could do something about that. Maybe air all these little meetings live and to the public so Solfed couldn't lie about what was said or the decisions made. Or more importantly, why things were the way they were. Any of those will require the triumvirate of liars before him to put their leadership at risk. Admitting defeat was as good as saying Solfed no longer mattered, that society no longer mattered. It would be the second so-called end of civilization since the Common Era. The first resulted in the Soul Era, with humanity crawling out from under the rubble they'd made and desperately fighting inevitable extinction. What would this one look like? How many would die this time, and how much more history would be vaporized as a result? Dunn said, I assume you expect this scientist to come back to Earth and spread the gospel of whatever new technologies and physics they come across? All 3 nodded.
What we really want,
the Chancellor said,
is to be completely independent of, non-carbon entities.
That was slick, Dunn thought with a grin. Meaning you want to learn new printer techniques, our upgraded systems, and etc., and how to build them without help from non-carbon entities. The Chancellor blushed but nodded curtly.
So we understand one another.
We do, Dunn said. However, you are asking a lot. Apart from new blood, you're offering us nothing and demanding everything.
Commander,
the Admiral said, emphasizing the title.
Can't you see it's in your best interest to ally with Solfed rather than remain enemies?
Talby hissed through his teeth before saying in a controlled voice, Article 15. The Admiral's mouth opened slightly before clamping shut. The Chancellor glanced at him, frowned, and returned her stare to the camera. She cleared her throat.
An unfortunate designation. However, please see things from our point of view. You were out of communication for a long period of time. We only have your word, and the questionable data recordings which could just as easily have been generated by the so-called collective.
Every word she said made him tighten his fist. He wondered how long it would be before his short, trimmed fingernails drew blood from his palms. Come out here. I'll guarantee your safety. Come out here, get in a suit with no HUD, and walk outside on the hull, Dunn said. Take a look at the void-damned Neptune Scar and tell me how the fuck it got there. The chief scientist was nodding.
I'd like to see it.
Dunn hadn't expected that. Of the 3 people on the call, she was the one Dunn least wanted to meet in person. Talby would probably space her. The Chancellor said,
Even if we agreed that a so-called exosolar threat existed and its defeat was the cause of the so-called scar, that still doesn't absolve you of treason to the human race.
Is that what you tell the public or just what you tell yourselves? Talby asked. Dunn gestured for him to let it go. Exactly what would. You've given us no means to prove we did not collaborate with the collective. By denying reality, you're denying us a defense. The pause was long, uncomfortable, and Dunn enjoyed it.
I understand your point of view, Commander,
The Chancellor said.
But what would you have us do?
Didn't I just ask that question? Dunn clasped his hands. We'll consider your requests. However, I want to make this perfectly clear. He leaned forward slightly and spoke in a low, calm, even voice. You have nothing we need nor want. You have no technology that can match our ships. We can reach you in a matter of hours while it takes you more than a week to get here. If, that is, you still have any ships that function. He paused to let that sink in and was pleased to see the Admiral's face turning a new shade of purple. If we want to, we can pinpoint your exact location and turn you into particles without hurting any civilians, much less disturbing the furniture around you. Do you understand? Now the three looked more scared than indignant. After no one spoke or so much as moved for a few beats, Dunn said, I'll take that as a yes. With that, he stabbed a button on the console, and the hollow display winked out of existence.